Hi, I believe dynamic leadership is essential for the success of any small business looking to grow and scale and thrive in today's ever-changing environment. In a world characterized by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, what we commonly refer to as a VUCA environment, traditional leadership approaches often fall short. Let's take a look at why. Before I start, just for context, I want to look at small businesses as 1 to 400 employees. And the reason why I cut it off there, and it's arbitrary because there are always going to be exceptions. But once you get much above 400, you start getting into this area where you're more likely to have complexity at the decision-making level. Small businesses have more freedom of action. Now, true, some of them below this size of 400, they might be owned by private equity, but the difference between being owned by a private equity or a single owner versus having a board that puts a CEO in place is very different. See, the small business owner leads downward. They lead their team. Of course, they have to pay attention to customers and what have you, but they don't have to lead upward and sideways and in different ways like the CEO who's been put in place by a board. And this, by the way, is why I think there's sometimes some difficulty in understanding best practices for leadership. If you're a small business owner and you're looking at some best practices for someone who was assigned to a position and then their leaders were actually put in place by the board or at least approved by the board, you can see there's some complexities versus when you have the sole decision making. Now, that doesn't mean dynamic leadership won't work above the 400, but there's those other considerations of leading and managing upward and sideways, and dynamic leadership helps with that as well. It's just different. Now, when I talk about growing and scaling, they go hand in hand. Anyone who's been running a business knows that constant tension as you grow, you then need to scale to keep up with the fulfillment. But if you spend money in scaling, then you don't have that money to pay for growing. So that's just normal. You have to work through that. And then the competition is always there. And I talk about following a metaphor of team. It's important to recognize that while we can take on the attitude and style and approach of a coach leading a winning team, but unlike that coach, we don't really have an opponent. Yes, we have competition. We're competing with more things than ever. It's not just the obvious competitor who's selling the same service or product, but we're competing with attention. We're competing with the other things that people want to spend their money on. But there's no opponent. There's nobody trying to return the ball. There's no one trying to stop your play. Now, you can come up with reasons, exceptions, etc. But my point is, we have sort of an opponentless game. We become that opponent, if you will. And that's where dynamic leadership shines, because we have the freedom to go forward fast. As I said, there's always going to be exceptions, but I wanted to put it into a frame that makes sense for everyone. A working definition helps. So dynamic leadership, it's an adaptive and flexible approach that empowers leaders to navigate change, make swift decisions, and align their teams with evolving business needs. It emphasizes agility, continuous learning, and the ability to respond effectively to both internal and external challenges, making it ideal for small businesses in fast-changing environments. Nothing against other styles. I approach this from a top-down view using first principles thinking. Dynamic leadership made the cut. Now, clearly, I could write something equally as good about any style. But again, I looked from top down. What are the needs of the small business? What are the complexities that they are facing? And then I looked at which leadership styles speak directly to that. Dynamic leadership is the one that came out on top. Now, I mentioned VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. This is not going to change. If you consider Moore's law, that's where the most common line of thinking is that technology doubles every 18 months. Initially, it was every 12 months back in the 60s. But when they looked at it in the 70s with a backwards view, they said that's more like every 18 months. Lately, I've seen Moore's law being changed again to every 2 years, regardless of which one you choose. The point is, technology has been increasing exponentially, let's call it doubling, since the 60s, every 2 years. That acceleration in technology, while it was initially based on chip capacity, and now it's more aligned with the speed of transmission, there's server speed and server capacity and algorithms doing the programming and on and on. So it just speeds everything up. And if you've done anything with artificial intelligence, you know how fast it goes. That's exponentially impacting everything around us. It also accelerates the political landscape, accelerates the geopolitical, geoeconomic landscapes, because the information is flowing so fast. It doesn't necessarily make it better, it makes it happen faster. This graph shows how this line, how we're on that steep part of the curve. If you've ever looked at one of those compounding graphs where you double a penny every day for 30 days, it turns into $10 million. That's that steep part. We're on that steep part. Those last 5 days of that 30 days is very steep. And that's where we are with technology and Moore's Law. So again, it's not going back. It's going to just get faster. And that's why I was looking for something that would work with the small business. Now, this list is not conclusive. It's not universal, but it gives you an idea. Capital, operational inefficiencies, compliance, regulation, infrastructure, supply chain risk. I mean, I could go on and on, but you get the idea. Now, when people look for solutions, there's no shortage of information. There's infographics all over the place. Just do a search on leadership infographics, business ownership infographics, success infographics. Nothing against infographics. What's interesting is when you look at these infographics, it's like motherhood and apple pie. Everyone would agree with these. It's good information that most leaders know, but it's not what we know. It's what we do and use. More importantly, it's what we do and use in a stressful situation. It wasn't always that way because we didn't run into stressful situations as often as we do now. So many people are walking around already on edge that it's very easy to drop into survival responses. And when you're in a survival response, you have less access to the knowledge, skills, and tools that you already are aware of. In addition to that, you have podcasts and YouTube channels, and people can get so much information for free. It gets to the point where you're getting conflicting messages and a confused mind doesn't move. Now, do you have a methodology to install the best practices promoted by all these channels and speakers? As a leader, you need that capability, and you need to train those right habits into your team. Army Rangers, Special Forces, Navy SEALs, they've shown that this can be done. These folks operate like machines because those habits and behaviors have been trained. And you can do the same thing with your teams, but you have to know what you're selecting. And when you have so many things to choose from and you're leaving it to chance, who knows what's being told to your team members and your employees? There's so many solutions. They can create their own volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And the point here is really that a confused mind doesn't move. What happens is you can very easily freeze. Now, too much conflicting information can cause stress, and it can cause a person to freeze. VUCA demands a response, and that response can be to do nothing. But choosing to do nothing and freezing are two completely different things. If you're freezing just as part of the stress response from fight, flight, freeze, or faint, that freeze is probably not a good thing. Growth requires scaling. Now, here's some things. It's leadership processes, operations, technology, talent-related processes, the right culture, financial management, fulfillment infrastructure. Things like talent-related resources may have been outsourced. Technology may have been outsourced. And if you're not careful, you can be creating this hodgepodge of connectivity that makes it even more difficult for you to scale. Of course, there are other things that are needed to scale, and some businesses don't need to scale everything on their list. However, I think there needs to be a conscious decision about what you choose to scale and when. And then, of course, the how comes into play. Scaling is hard. Bandwidth, there's never enough. One reason is because successful businesses are operating with excellence. And operational excellence has a timeline that goes with it. When you're pivoting or changing a project or creating some new capability, That project work is stepping into the unknown, and the unknown always takes longer. The point is, you have to make sure you give yourself enough time, and we talk about how to do that, and dynamic leadership supports that as well. The other thing that happens is as you grow, you're impacted by more regulations, and there are also things that come into play as you grow that were not necessarily on your radar when you were smaller. And likewise, there are some cultural constraints. When I say cultural, meaning in your organization, there's some parts of your organizational culture that don't rear their ugly head until you get to certain sizes, or maybe until you start moving somebody's cheese. Now, this changing landscape can be confusing. It used to be that you could do a SWOT analysis, and that analysis, that point of view lasted for maybe a few years. It certainly lasted long enough to get the strategy in place. Today, that SWOT analysis can become obsolete in weeks. All it takes is a new entrant, some new capability, some major regulatory change. It could be anything. And that SWOT analysis is no longer valid, and you've spent money for the strategy that's not even unfolded yet. It can be confusing, and again, that confused mind doesn't move, so we need to take care of that. When I began looking for the go-to leadership style that I wanted to get behind, I needed something that could be delegated, scaled, and measured, because the owner has to delegate that leadership process. All the new leaders coming in have to be trained on that and then expected to do that. Back to the Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Special Forces, they all get the same playbook. Just like a winning team, all the coaches are operating out of the same playbook. I wanted something that was going to be simple, easily accessible, easy to understand, easy to teach and scale, and easy to measure. And again, dynamic leadership makes the cut. It provides simplicity and consistency in your operation, which I would argue is a better response to VUCA than trying to react each time. 30 years ago, nimble was good because you can react faster to these changes. The changes are coming so fast now, reacting to them just creates a bunch of whipsaws that create more confusion. Rather than trying to react, what we want to do is stay consistent with simplicity, and the VUCA will just happen around us. It's sort of like standing on the truth and the world conforms around you. So here's what we imagine after we set up a new strategy. We're moving along and we hit that inflection point and the trajectory goes upward and doesn't stop. But here's what we often get. It's just more of the same. Culture overrides strategy, and change is harder. Most of the leadership material that is available doesn't talk about making it through that inflection point. That's why the book Good to Great by Jim Collins is recommended reading for all my clients. It provides a set of principles that the small business owner can follow, and they don't have to reinvent the wheel. Why reinvent the wheel when it comes to principles and fundamentals? So as they try harder, it seems to be more and more impossible. That gap can seem insurmountable, but yet we keep trying. That inflection point, making this cut, changing the trajectory, requires new skills. Not the skills that we're working down here. Not the skills that you're going to be using up here. And there are plenty of books about this. And there are plenty of books about leading here. It's not enough about leading here. Now, dynamic leadership, it works in all three places. And that's why I like it. So it gets you ready for that inflection point. It serves you through the inflection point, and it serves you as you move, and it allows you to scale, and it even works up and down throughout the leadership hierarchy. Now, breaking through inertia is harder than people think. It gets back to project versus operational, but it's deeper than that because you have culture in here. In this inertia, you have culture. You have stories. You have sacred cows. You have incentives. You have cheese that it gets moved if you go through that inertia. Not only that, when you get above it, it's kind of scary because you get into the unfamiliar and the unknown. And the unconscious sees the unfamiliar and the unknown as threats. Now, while we're talking about organizations, remember, organizations are made up of people, and people have habits, and they're susceptible to these subconscious fears. You're not sure where they're going to kick in, but they do kick in, and then you get this dynamic that happens up here, which is why culture is so important to develop as you break out of this inertia and start on this projected path, you want the culture to be such that you're not getting whipsawed and knocked around by the VUCA. Making the shift, sustaining that shift, and having fun doing it, it's a process. It's a process that anyone can learn, and it's a process that can be followed, it can be delegated, it can be taught, and it can be tracked. It requires resiliency. And resiliency, for me, is not just having resiliency, which you could also call a growth mindset, but it's being able to get back to a growth mindset no matter how many times you get knocked off, and to reduce the amount of time it takes you to get back to a growth mindset. The way I view it is you want to get back to a growth mindset so quickly, it doesn't look like you ever left. That's what I mean when I say resiliency. And then you see we have the opportunities. That becomes VUCA noise. If you're staying with your simple and consistent approach based on your strengths, even opportunities become VUCA noise. And of course, the threats are going to be VUCA noise. So by following principles and consistency, the VUCA noise doesn't impact you. Now, will there be things from the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity space that impact you? Absolutely. Will you have to deal with them? Yes. Remember, a response could be to do nothing. But sometimes you will have to take action, and that's okay because dynamic leadership guides you in terms of how you run those projects and pivots, and you can do it in such a way that you take advantage of new opportunities or maybe opportunities that you put on the back burner for a while. Dynamic leadership enables adaptability, innovation, resilience, collaboration, effectiveness, and efficiency. And those are different. It's very important to make the distinction. Scalability, empowerment, and a vision-driven culture. I talked about coaches on it with the team having the same playbook. Imagine having all the leaders operating out of the same playbook. It doesn't happen because too many businesses don't delegate a leadership process on purpose. They hire leaders and then they let the leaders have their freedom of action. Imagine a team that brings in a top quarterback but just lets the quarterback do their thing. That team still has to ingrain the plays in with that quarterback. There might be some collaboration in terms of what's chosen and what's dropped, but that quarterback, or whatever position you want to use for the team, still has to integrate into the team. That doesn't always happen in business, and it needs to. And again, dynamic leadership paints a picture. I believe there should be a development plan, a 2-year development plan for every employee, including leaders. Now, obviously, an entry-level employee is going to have a different development plan than an experienced leader. But that development plan is not about developing them. It's about integrating them into the vision and culture so that we can become a high-performing team. You can attend a live interactive Q&A to see how this works with your organization. This presentation gives a nice high-level overview, but in that interactive session, we will delve into specific questions. We'll keep the group small, and that way you can get the answers to your questions. So attend that live interactive Q&A, click the link, and I'll see you on the other side.